final speaker is Roger Schonfeld, who is Director of Libraries, Scholarly Communications, and Museum Programs within Ithaka SNR. So Roger, we can see your slides. You should be all set.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Todd. I'm in the fortunate position of batting cleanup here for this excellent event, and so I'm going to be reflecting on a little bit of what we've heard and some of the other directions that I see as strategies that the information community may be pursuing, or that we may want to be mindful of the need to issues that we may wish to be mindful of the need to address collectively. I work for Ithaka SNR, which is a research and advisory service for higher education, and we work with libraries and scholarly publishers and other kinds of information organizations across the board. Since the pandemic, even before the pandemic came to North America, actually, Ithaka SNR has been focusing in a variety of different ways on trying to understand and help higher education institutions and publishers address the implications of the present period of disruption. And I won't try to go through all of these areas of work, but only to say that we've talked to dozens of library leaders, we've done surveys, we've collaborated with others, we've looked at forecasting budgets, we've done some client work as well. And so I feel like we have a reasonably good, rounded view of some of what is taking place and what we may expect to see in the next year or two. In terms of immediate challenges, and we've heard almost all of this already today. Obviously, the clawbacks in the existing fiscal year budget have been probably the most immediate set of budgetary challenges. The disruptions and the need to disperse student bodies and so forth as well.
Roger, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but could you, you're fading in and out a little bit with your microphone. If you could position it a little bit more closely.
Oh, sure. I'm sorry about that. We've seen organizations that know, this is maybe a little bit exaggerated, but organizations that know almost nothing about public health as organizations, and organizations that have avoided asking hard questions about their own business models. Our universities are now grappling with both together. This is producing, and other factors too, are producing enormous complexities around decision-making which is highly politicized around when and how and in what ways it's safe or reasonable or patriotic or what have you to reopen. Now, at the same time, there's reason not to completely despair, and I think this is something that in some conversations is getting lost. As we're looking at fall enrollment numbers that have been trickling in, it doesn't look like we're going to see a worst case scenario for this fall. And indeed, quite a number of institutions have indicated their preference, if not commitment, to trying to reopen residential instruction. So I think we're starting to see something that is not quite a worst case scenario for the fall that, fingers crossed, knock on wood, appears to be emerging. Now, that said, I think you're going to hear me, you're going to hear this as a constant refrain across a number of my remarks. There are substantial equity issues in the relative impacts as we dig in beneath the overall aggregate that we're often talking about. That is to say that students from different racial or socioeconomic groups are being affected differently according to some of the projections that are coming out. Different kinds of institutions are going to experience different kinds of impacts. And I think that that's something that all of us should be giving as much attention to as possible, and not just looking at aggregate figures. Over the longer run, it would be hard not to foresee revenue declines in almost every area of the university. We heard from Dean about the complexity of university budgets and the various sources and some of the tactics that can be used, strategies that can be used. It's hard not to imagine an overall dip in revenue for at least some period of time. Some of this is exacerbating pre-existing challenges. I want to really emphasize that higher education has not been in a perfect state in the United States over the last several years. We've seen state appropriations that have barely recovered where they were 10 or 15 years ago. We've seen demographic pressures that are important to recognize. So disaggregating what are the impacts of the pandemic from what are the pre-existing challenges that some higher education institutions would have faced anyway is maybe an interesting research study, but probably doesn't matter very much in terms of how this will affect libraries and information providers. Other longer term impacts, we can certainly expect to see distance learning growing even for traditional residential institutions. As much as everyone craves going back to normal, quote unquote, I think we're likely to see something that looks a lot more like a new normal for many of these institutions for quite some time, if not for the long run. And I'm expecting to see an acceleration of closures and mergers of higher education institutions, which is another way of saying that institutionally the effects will not be evenly distributed. What may happen to an Ivy League institution, to a selective private college, to a flagship state institution that is well-funded is very different than what we may expect to see in many other parts of the higher education sector. And I think closures and mergers are something that we will see even more of than we have in recent years. And again, I just want to continue to emphasize that there's every reason to foresee substantial equity issues that arise as we look at the relative impacts. And here I don't mean just in terms of differing institutions, but also in terms of differing students, different employee classes, employee groups, et cetera. So with that as just a sort of introduction, I'd like to speak specifically to some of the impact that we may expect to see in some of the strategic dilemmas that I'm hearing from really across libraries and publishers and other information providers as they look out into the coming years. So I'm going to start with the budget of the academic library, which is in some ways foundational to the rest of the discussion. Almost all, possibly not every single higher education library in the United States, but almost all of them will face meaningful budget reductions. This is complicated because the amount of uncertainty in terms of revenue for the upcoming fiscal year that universities are envisioning is making long-term planning at many libraries essentially impossible. This is a very surprising turn of events. It's or I should say, it's an unusual turn of events that that there's so much uncertainty in a budgeting process. I believe Dennis actually pointed a little bit to the to one side of some of the tension that I'm expecting that we'll see. We do have some librarians, not all of them, but some who often prefer to take cuts when possible out of their materials budget. But we also sometimes see faculty members a little bit more likely to prefer taking budget cuts out of library personnel. And I can point to a number of cases where institutions have faced some complicated tensions around those differing preferences. But in any case, over the longer term, not just what can we expect for the next fiscal year, we can probably expect to see some substantial organizational pressures or opportunities, potentially some additional mergers, whether with university presses or museums or teaching and learning centers, with the idea of reducing overhead, reducing, increasing efficiencies. We can potentially look to see strengthened consortia, not just as buying clubs, but really in terms of the array of different services and indeed collections that some consortia, as Amy was talking about in some of her remarks, can provide. I think those could, I won't be surprised if the spectrum between strengthening consortia and considering merging libraries across higher education institutions isn't one that we'll want to look to. I think that the we've not seen nearly as many of those kinds of mergers, but as we have groups of institutions talking about collaborating ever more closely on collections, and groups of institutions, even major research institutions talking about creating a single shared collection across more than a dozen major research universities, I think we'll start to see questions about what is it that requires separate organizational structures at different higher education institutions. Isn't there an opportunity to really think about shared libraries and shared library services? We touched on space already a little bit. Many libraries that have been positioning communal spaces for learning, has in some cases talked about that as being one of their most important services. I appreciated, Dennis, your framing a little bit differently than this, but I do think that that's something I've heard from a number of other library leaders. And I think for them, there will be questions about to what extent this kind of value will remain available when residential campuses reopen. I think there's also questions about how that might translate into a distance environment. I want to talk about personnel a little bit as well. We can certainly expect to see substantial impacts on library personnel, as others have spoken about, there have been efforts to try to preserve jobs in the near term. Humane and strong leadership efforts that have gone into that work. What may be possible in the fall will depend significantly on whether institutions are remote or not. I expect that institutions that have not resumed face-to-face teaching will be under substantial pressure to reconsider staffing models that are tied to in-person service, circulation desks, tangible collection processing, etc. Looking in the longer term, libraries that have not already done so will finally transform their print acquisitions and print material processing activities. This probably will impact staff to a significant degree in some institutions. And where that is the case, based on work we've done about library employee diversity and patterns of staff diversity across job types, we will expect to see some substantial negative impact on staff diversity as a result of some of those changes, which is something to be, libraries in particular should be mindful of. The idea that all job reductions, all personnel actions will be tied to those responsible for in-person services or tangible materials is a best case scenario. I think we have to be mindful that there may be cases where other kinds of cuts, including to some of the strategic service directions that academic libraries have been trying to move in, may be taken. I'd like to talk about formats and then about licenses in a moment. So I've been extremely impressed with the emergency temporary access service that HathiTrust has made available. This is a program to allow members whose print collections have been rendered unavailable to access those materials digitally. It's a form of controlled digital lending that is more controlled than what Internet Archive's National Emergency Library was, for those who've been following that. It's been a lifeline for HathiTrust members. It's enabled them to provide substantial continuing access to in-copyright print collections that would otherwise have been impossible to do. I'm hearing from a number of HathiTrust members that they may wish to limit their print availability even after it's possible to resume on-campus library access in order to continue providing this kind of emergency temporary access service. And that indeed, if they could do that, which they're not sure they can, but if they could do that, It's really based on a sense of just how valuable the digital access has proven to be. We'll see what happens there, but I would just point out that the emergency nature of the service may give way to some opportunities to build a longer term service model here. And I think that could be an interesting area of partnership actually between academic libraries and a variety of publishers. Separately, but I think importantly, I think we're seeing a lot of evidence that the shift away from print acquisitions, especially of books today, and towards increasingly digital collections while there will be a resumption at some point of print acquisitions, I think we're seeing a permanent acceleration of that shift. For better, for worse, there's no value judgment in what I'm saying, but I think the service model benefits of digital have seemed to be quite clear to many libraries and other administrators in this period of disruption. So I want to talk a little bit about licensing as well, because resource pricing is something that's coming under some interesting scrutiny right now. As you know, many providers have made a variety of different kinds of resources temporarily freely available or available on an expanded basis. And certainly there's been a lot of goodwill generated, a lot of gratitude from some portions of the library community for these free services that a number of providers have offered. There's also some concerns about these temporary free access services. There are concerns that some library directors have shared with us about whether these will make it impossible, whether it will be impossible for them to walk away from free services, whether their faculty members or other campus constituents will find it make it impossible for them to move away from these services when they don't have the resources to afford them over time. There have been other kinds of concerns about what data are being gathered and how that might affect publishers' ability to in the sales cycle in the future. So just to say that those have been quite valuable. I've heard some informal conversation about how much usage some of those have received, but there are also some concerns as well. Now, as to price over the longer run, over the next year or two, the medium term, as you know, a number of publishers and providers have announced price freezes. Some of them with more fanfare than others, but there's a number of price freezes for the upcoming year, at least, that have been announced on listservs and elsewhere. We've heard even today that some libraries are beginning to request, or in some cases even demand, price reductions from publishers, and in some cases publishers have been quick to agree to those, which is interesting. I've also been tracking a sense that some publishers have as a question about how much of these requested or demanded price cuts are out of necessity, given that many libraries haven't really settled their budget for the coming year. So to what extent is this just an opportunistic moment to ask for a price cut? This is a question that I've heard from some publishers who feel that distinguishing between, where is their customer who has some need and they'd like to help the customer versus where is their opportunism and they'd like to not do that, distinguishing between those two is proving for some to be a real challenge. So I'm going to close with just 2 or 3 more slides. I want to talk about product directions. I think this is one of the most important areas that, as publishers and other information providers are assessing the landscape in front of them, some of them have recognized, some of them have long recognized that library budgets are essentially tapped out. This will take them in a couple of different directions, and it's already taking some in a couple of different directions. I want to start by talking about efficiency, because I think that one of the places that is hardest to scrutinize, but ultimately the most important for all parties to scrutinize, is where are there opportunities to squeeze greater efficiencies out of operations and products. Let me say a little bit about what I mean by that. If publishers and other vendors can drive greater efficiency into their own internal operations, they can either create price reductions or greater margin. And there's every reason to think that they should be encouraged to do that in the normal course of affairs. But as we know, this is a unique moment for those who might want to scrutinize internal operations. I would also like to suggest that very few vendors, a few, but very few, have looked at how they can drive greater efficiency in their own product structure. What are the products they're offering? How do those products get used within libraries, acquired by libraries, used by end users? How can that be improved so that libraries don't have to devote nearly as much expertise and frankly, staff time to managing this vast array of products? I think Ralph's talk pointed to one way that there may be opportunities to reduce at least institutional overheads associated with authentication and authorization. But what I have in mind is something that would take that and really go quite a bit further than that. So those are some questions for the vendors and publishers among us today. I think the other area that is unquestionably happening and will certainly accelerate is efforts to diversify revenue channels. Publishers are so dependent on academic libraries. Many publishers, I should say, are so dependent on academic libraries for their revenues today. And with library budgets tapped out and in many cases in decline, questions about where is it possible to create and offer products or services that support the research enterprise or the teaching and learning enterprise, that sell into the provost's office, the senior research officer, the CIO's office, rather than the library, is something that a lot of publishers will be giving more attention to. And we can certainly talk more about that if there are questions or interest in that. I want to close with a couple of difficult questions about management and culture. Because I think we all realize this, but we are truly in an extraordinary period. It's not only a public health emergency, there's a profound economic disruption globally. In the United States, we're facing a national crisis around racial justice. And these collectively and individually have exposed bad culture, problematic practices, called those to greater attention in a variety of organizations, including those that are represented in the NISO community. And I think there are questions about whether organizations, many of whom have issued statements or are doing work internally to think about some of these issues and opportunities, whether organizations will actually address weaknesses in their products, in how their services are structured, in their work practices, in their organizational cultures. I think this is a moment for introspection and to challenge ourselves to do more and to do better in a variety of these kinds of ways. I also think that for many of our organizations, especially libraries that have little culture around remote work, many organizations are now thinking anew about whether there will be a permanent shift towards remote work and what that will look like, the kinds of performance expectations, the kind of management practices that are necessary to enable that. And I would just say that I think those questions are ones that many of our employees are going to come back face to face or be asked to come back face to face when they've been living not dozens of miles away from the office, but they've potentially moved hundreds or thousands of miles away from the office and see no reason why they can't continue to contribute valuably as they have been over the past 3 months in a new normal. So let me stop there. I think those are some of the issues that I'd like to I hope is useful to call to everyone's attention. I think we'll see a variety of pretty profound changes, and I look forward to talking with you about them. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Roger. That was a fantastic, that was a home run. Nice way to clean the bases.